The new Grixis Lind Cheerful Tormentor is not the only way to play with curses in Commander. With all of the new curses released in both Innistrad Midnight Hunt and Innistrad Crimson Vow, I think now is a great time to revisit Tiana Ship's Caretaker as the leader of a Boros Curses deck. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and we are all about unconventional Commander decks on this channel. And today let's talk about Tiana Ship's Caretaker. Tiana is a 3/3 Angel Artificer with flying and first strike that costs 3 red-white. Tiana has, whenever an aura or equipment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. And if that ability sounds familiar, it's because Tiana is kind of a bad version of Feather the Redeemed. Just as Feather lets you recover your instants and sorceries from your graveyard, at least the ones that target your creatures, Tiana does the same for your auras and equipment. Now, unlike instants and sorceries, which go to the graveyard as they resolve so Feather can get them back, while auras and equipment are typically intended to stay on the battlefield for a while. So taking advantage of Tiana's ability to recur them from the graveyard is a bit trickier than Feather. But there are some auras and equipment that work well in a Tiana deck. Like Capuchin Standard. This is an aura that enchants a creature, it costs white, it gives the enchanted creature +1/+1, and it lets you pay 2 and sacrifice it to draw a card. So if you've got Tiana on the field, she'll return Capuchin Standard to your hand at the end of the turn, so you can use it again next turn. Now, paying 3 mana once per round of the table to draw 1 card is very mediocre, but it is repeatable card draw, and in Boros, that might be good enough. Or Soul Tithe, which enchants a permanent, and then that permanent's controller has to pay X mana at the beginning of their upkeep, or sacrifice the permanent, where X is the permanent's mana value. Of course, if X is just too much for them and they do sacrifice the permanent, then Soul Tithe will just come back to your hand with Tiana, so you can use it again. So there are some interesting things you can do with Tiana that make it a very unique commander. Now of course we can also play curses with Tiana. Curses are auras that will enchant a player, and they typically either damage or otherwise hinder that player from doing things. Now a big problem with curses is that once you've enchanted a player with a curse, you can't move that curse around to another player later if your threat assessment changes. And of course if that player does die, all of those curses go away. But with Tiana, and a sacrifice outlet for enchantments, you'll have the freedom to move your curses around much more easily. Since once you sacrifice a curse, Tiana will return that curse to your hand at the end of the turn after you sacrifice it, so you can cast it again later, targeting another player. So with this deck, we'll use red and white curses to slow down our opponents. But these curses alone won't win games. We'll also use auras as removal or control to supplement our curses and prevent our opponents from executing their strategies. Now to finish our opponents off, we use a combination of aggressive auras to boost our combat potential, and we'll also use some enchantment payoffs that generate tokens, letting us go wide if we need to get in for lethal combat damage in true Boros fashion. So that's the deck strategy. Let's get into the contents of this deck, starting with the curses. Now with the release of Innistrad Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow, we've got new curses to play with. In fact, in Boros colors, we've got 18 curses that we could use. But some of them are very, very bad, and even though this is a curses deck, I'd rather play a small package of effective curses than play bad cards. So this deck has 9 curses, which generally serve to slow down our opponents, or sometimes pressure their life totals. The most fun ones, well, at least for us, maybe not for our opponents, include Overwhelming Splendor, which costs a whopping 8 mana, but it also makes all creatures the enchanted player controls lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 1/1. Oh, and also that player can't activate abilities on anything, except for mana abilities or Planeswalker loyalty abilities. Or Curse of Obsession, this is another fun one. This has the enchanted player draw 2 extra cards during their draw step, but at the beginning of their end step they discard their hand, so that's hilarious. Curse of Exhaustion is mean, but sometimes people do mean things, and so Curse of Exhaustion can be justified. This one prevents the enchanted player from casting more than one spell each turn. Curse of Opulence ramps us with treasures, and it encourages other people to attack the cursed player too. But there are also some more interesting new curses from the recent Innistrad sets. A Curse of Silence costs just a single white mana, and when it enters the battlefield you choose a card name. Perhaps someone's commander, perhaps some disgusting Simic commander like AC. Spells with the chosen name cast by the enchanted player cost 2 more mana to cast, and whenever the enchanted player casts a spell with the chosen name, you can sacrifice Curse of Silence, and if you do, you draw a card. And this one is really great with Tiana, because you'll get that Curse of Silence back to your hand after you sacrifice it, so you can use it again. We have Blind Obedience, which isn't really a curse, but it kind of is, it's just better because it affects all opponents. And note that it's not an aura though, so Tiana won't affect it. But we also have the new Radiant Grace, which is an enchant creature aura that gives the creature +1/+0 in vigilance. But when the enchanted creature dies, you return Radiant Grace to the battlefield transformed under your control and attached to target opponent. And it transforms into an aura curse. Radiant Restraints causes creature the enchanted player controls to enter the battlefield tapped. Curse of Hospitality is really fun too. This curse gives all creatures attacking the enchanted player trample. And whenever a creature deals combat damage to the enchanted player, that player exiles the top card of their library, and until end of turn, that creature's controller, that is, the player controlling the creature that dealt the combat damage, that creature's controller may play that card and may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. So this is also a really great incentive for your opponents to attack the cursed player. Now we do have a couple of curses that also help directly deal damage, or at least help deal damage, to our opponent's life totals as well. A Curse of Bloodletting doubles all damage that would be dealt to the enchanted player. And Maddening Hex is a fun but chaotic one. Whenever the enchanted player casts a non-creature spell, you roll a d6, and Maddening Hex deals damage to that player equal to the result. Then you attach Maddening Hex to another one of your opponents, chosen at random. So those are the curses I've chosen to use, but we've got plenty of other auras in this deck. We'll use auras as removal spells to supplement those curses in controlling our opponents. Let's talk about those next. Now combined with our curses, we've got some prison auras that can really lock our opponents down and help us win the game. And we've picked some auras that we can use as removal that can be reused repeatedly with Tiana's ability, like Flamespeaker's Will and Mortal Obstinacy. These cost just a single mana and give the enchanted creature +1/+1, and when the enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, you can sacrifice the aura to destroy a target artifact, in the case of Flamespeaker's Will, or destroy a target enchantment in the case of Mortal Obstinacy. These are great with Tiana because, again, once you sacrifice them, you get them back to your hand to reuse them over and over. But we can use auras as removal directly too. A Candle Trap gives the enchanted creature Defender and prevents all damage it would deal. But you can also pay 2 and a white and sacrifice Candle Trap to exile the enchanted creature. Now you can only do this if you have Coven, that is if you have 3 or more creatures with different powers. And again, we like these auras that can be sacrificed because then Tiana can get them back for us, and we can use them again. Heliod's Punishment prevents the enchanted creature from attacking or blocking for a little while. It enters the battlefield with 4 task counters, and the enchanted creature can tap to remove a task counter from it. Then if it has no task counters on it, you destroy Heliod's Punishment. And again, of course, if Tiana's in the field when that happens, you put it back into your hand at the end of the turn. Temporal Isolation has Flash, which I really like. It gives the enchanted creature Shadow and prevents all damage it would deal. This effectively makes the creature unable to block and unable to attack to any real effect most of the time. And I already mentioned Soul Tithe, which is really awesome. First, it can enchant any type of permanent, and that permanent's controller has to pay mana equal to that permanent's mana value at the beginning of each of their upkeeps, or sacrifice the permanent. So it's a great tax, but again, if they choose to sacrifice the permanent, you just get Soul Tithe back to your hand. Well, again, as long as Tiana is in play. So those are some of our auras that we can use as removal. But we're not done talking about auras and aura payoffs. After we've locked our opponents down, we'll do what Boros does best, turn creatures sideways. Let's talk about some auras that help us do that. Now, curses may slow our opponents down, but they won't win games for us on their own, for the most part. So as long as we're playing Boros, let's aura our own creatures up and turn them sideways for the win. We're playing a few of the heaviest hitting auras that we can find in these colors. All That Glitters gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment you control. Sage's Reverie draws you some cards, and also gives the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each aura you control that's attached to a creature. This will also count some of our other auras that are removal spells basically on our opponent's creatures. The Mantle of the Ancients is an all-star, giving the enchanted creature +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to it. Oh, and also when it enters the battlefield, it returns any number of auras and equipment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield and attaches them to the enchanted creature. This can be an absolute blowout. Then there's the new Catilda Dawnheart Martyr, which is a spirit creature with flying, lifelink, and protection from vampires, and it has power and toughness, each equal to the number of permanents you control that are spirits and/or enchantments. But in addition to being really good at wearing auras, it can also be cast from your graveyard for its disturb cost of 3 white. And when you cast it from your graveyard this way, it's transformed into Catilda's Rising Dawn, and this is an aura that gives the enchanted creature the same text as Catilda has. It gives it flying, first strike, protection from vampires, and +X/+X, where X is the number of permanents you control that are spirits and/or enchantments. Now, unfortunately, Catilda's Rising Dawn does not work with Tiana. It has, if Catilda's Rising Dawn would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So we won't be able to reuse this aura with our commander. But it's such a powerful effect that I've included it in the deck anyways. We've also got some smaller utility auras. Some of these protect our creatures, like Hyena Umbro, which has totem armor, or Ward of Lights and Benevolent Blessing, which give the enchanted creature protection from a color of your choice. Now, I really like Ward of Lights because it can be cast at instant speed, and if you do, you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next cleanup step. So if you've got Tiana out on the field, you'll get it back to your hand after you sacrifice it, so you can keep using it over and over. And just to be aware that because Ward of Lights is sacrificed at the cleanup step, which is after the beginning of the end step, Tiana won't actually return it to your hand until the beginning of the next turn's end step, so you will have to wait one turn before you can use it again. But in general, this is really good, repeatable protection that you can use over and over again when Tiana's on the field for just 2 white mana each time. We've got some utility auras that can be reused multiple times, helping us get more ETB triggers from some of our Enchantments Matter cards, like Sentinel's Eyes, which has escape so it can be cast from the graveyard, or Spirit Loop, which goes back to your hand when it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. And then there's Spectral Steel, which gives your enchanted creature +2/+2, and you can exile it from your graveyard to return another aura or equipment from your graveyard to your hand. So again, we've got a mixture of heavy-hitting auras as well as some utility auras that buff our creatures a little bit, but also provide some other value. Now let's talk about some of the creatures that are great targets for those Boros combat auras. Now again, even though we're controlling our opponents with curses and prison-style auras, we actually need to win the game at some point. We have a few key creatures that make great targets for our combat auras. Like Wyleth, Soul of Steel, this is a 2/2 with trample that has you draw a card for each aura and equipment attached to it whenever it attacks. Or Armored Skyhunter, which also has evasion, this time in the form of flying, and it also has a form of card advantage. Now when it attacks, you look at the top 6 cards of your library, and you can put an aura or equipment from among them directly onto the battlefield. Cavalier of Dawn is a decent-sized body, it's 4/6 with vigilance, and so it's a reasonable target to suit up with auras. It's also removal and recursion. It destroys a non-land permanent when it enters the battlefield, and it returns an artifact, or more importantly, an enchantment, from your graveyard to your hand when it dies. The Sun Titan is also a great aura target, it's a 6/6 with vigilance, and it'll help you recover your spent auras in case Tiana isn't around. And then finally, we've got Heavenly Blade Master. Now this one's not a utility creature, it's purely a combat payoff. Heavenly Blade Master is a 3/6 with flying and double strike. When it enters the battlefield, you can attach any number of auras and equipment you control to it, and other creatures you control get +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to it. Heavenly Blade Master will absolutely end games. If we've made a lot of tokens, which is possible in this deck, and we'll talk about that later, then Heavenly Blade Master can be a pretty reasonable anthem to make your army really big. Now we've got other creatures in this deck that make decent targets for our combat auras as well, but most of them perform some other function like card draw or mana ramp or making tokens, so we'll talk about those later. For now, let's talk about some of our other aura support pieces. Now one thing we really want with Tiana is some sort of sacrifice outlet for our enchantments. This way we can sacrifice our auras to selectively get them back to our hand with Tiana, letting us redeploy them more favorably, like moving a curse to another player, or maybe dodging exile-based removal against our auras, or just getting ETBs of our auras again and again. Oratog and Faith Healer are both creatures that let us sacrifice enchantments whenever we want for free. Faith Healer also gains us a little bit of life whenever we do so. We've also got Lunarch Mantle. This is an aura that can sacrifice auras, or well, any other permanent. It gives the enchanted creature +2/+2, but we can also pay 1 and sacrifice a permanent to give the enchanted creature flying until end of turn. Now, like I mentioned earlier, we also want some payoff for continually casting auras or other enchantments. And I focused on token makers, because these cards can make us a game-winning army all on their own, just for doing what the deck wants to do. Archon of Sun's Grace is a 3/4 flying lifelinker that makes you a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control. And this works really well with Tiana and one of your sacrifice outlets, or with an aura that can just sacrifice itself, because it'll let you make tons and tons of tokens repeatedly. For example, if you sacrifice Spirit Loop to Oratog, it'll make a Pegasus. Then the Spirit Loop goes back to your hand, where you can recast it, sacrifice it again, and repeat, making as many Pegasi as you've got the mana to do so. Broodkeeper is similar, but a little more limited. It's a 2/3 creature that makes 2/2 flying, fire-breathing dragon tokens whenever an aura is attached to it. Now for the same mana cost as Archon of Sun's Grace, Broodkeeper is a bit smaller, and it only makes tokens when you put an aura on it, rather than whenever any enchantment enters the battlefield. But again, I really like that these tokens have flying, so getting them in for combat damage should be relatively easy most of the time. Sigil of the Empty Throne also makes flyers whenever you cast an enchantment spell. Note that this is on cast, and not when an enchantment enters the battlefield, so it's slightly restrictive, but most of the time our enchantments will be cast, so it doesn't make a huge difference in this deck. But Sigil of the Empty Throne makes 4/4 flying angels instead of 2/2s, and it's on a harder to remove enchantment rather than a creature. Yes, it is a 5 mana do-nothing spell, but it will absolutely win games, so it's worth a spot here. And finally there's the new Hallowed Haunting. This is another do-nothing enchantment, but at least this one only costs 4 mana. It has as long as you control 7 or more enchantments, creatures you control have flying and vigilance. But also, whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you create a Spirit Cleric creature token with this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of spirits you control. Now this isn't a spirit deck, so most likely the first time you make a token with Hallowed Haunting, it'll be a 1/1, and it doesn't have any evasion. But if you manage to make several tokens with this, they'll all be pretty big. And again, Hallowed Haunting is an enchantment, so it can be harder to remove than some of our creatures that make tokens. So I think it's also worth a spot here. Now we'll also use a few aura support cards. Sigarda's Aid is an enchantment that lets us cast all of our auras at instant speed, which really helps when we're sacrificing them to Tiana, because then we can recast them during our opponent's turns, and maybe sacrifice them again right away, rather than waiting until our turn to recast them. Open the Armory is a self-explanatory aura tutor that we can use to basically get whatever we want, a curse, a buff for our creatures, or just removal aura like Temporal Isolation. And Crystal Chimes is a single-use artifact that lets us recover all of our enchantments from our graveyard to your hand. It's a bit expensive to use at 3 mana to cast and 3 to activate, but it can be well worth it. So those are some of our aura support cards. Now let's go over some of our notable card draw, mana ramp, and lands. Now white and green are the strongest enchantment colors in all of Magic, with plenty of Enchantress effects, but we have access to some in Boros as well. A Core Spirit Dancer draws you a card whenever you cast an aura spell, It also gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it, so it's a decent target for your buffing auras, though it doesn't have any evasion on its own. SRAM Senior Edificer also draws you a card whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell. And Mesa Enchantress draws you a card whenever you cast any enchantment spell. There's Esper Sentinel, which is a bit expensive at $20, or a bit cheap at only a single white mana, however you want to look at it. But either way, it is great card draw. It's a 1/1 artifact creature with whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, you may draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. You could even use some of your auras to buff Esper Sentinel's power so that your opponents pretty much never pay that X cost and you'll always get to draw the card off of it. Now we've already mentioned Capuchin Standard, which is repeatable card draw with Tiana on the field, though it's still somewhat limited to being generally usable only once for each rotation of the table, and it costs 3 mana each time. And then we'll use Outpost Siege. This is a 4-mana enchantment, so we'll trigger all of our enchantments matter cards, and it gives us an additional impulsive card draw at the beginning of each of our upkeeps. Now when it comes to mana ramp, I've selected several white creatures that help us pull planes directly out of our library and into play, as long as an opponent controls more lands than we do. Creatures like Cartographer's Hawk, Knight of the White Orchid, Loyal Warhound, Oreskos Explorer, Verge Rangers, and Keeper of the Accord. Now because these give us land-based ramp, our mana base will be more resilient over using something like artifact-based ramp. And because these are creatures, we can suit them up with auras if we need to. And some of them are decent when they're enchanted, like Knight of the White Orchid and Verge Rangers, which have First Strike. There's Loyal Warhound, which is a 3/1 with Vigilance, so it's fragile but it has decent power, and Cartographer's Hawk has Flying. And lastly, we'll use some utility lands to help out our game plan. Hall of Heliod's Generosity is an enchantment deck staple that you can pay 1 and a white and tap it to put a target enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. Sajiri Shelter can help protect our creatures, or since it's an MDFC, we can also play it as a tapped land. Slayer's Stronghold also helps boost our combat ability. We can pay white, red, and tap it to give a target creature +2/+0, Vigilance, and Haste until end of turn. And Bonder's Enclave and Arch of Orazca can help us draw cards if we really need to, and because we're playing Boros, we just might. And that is the deck. Now let's go over the deck stats and cost. This Tiana Ship's Caretaker Curses deck has an average mana value of 2.94. We have 9 curses in this deck, which I admit doesn't sound like a lot, but again I didn't want to play bad curses. And also curses for the most part don't win games on their own, so I just don't think it makes sense to jam 30 or so curses into a deck, even if you can, just because so few of the curses in all of Magic can actually kill an opponent most of the time. This deck has a total of 33 enchantments, of which 27 are auras, which is what Tiana cares about, though we do have other support cards like Sigil of the Empty Throne and Mesa Enchantress that just care about enchantments and not auras specifically. We have a total of 20 creatures, not counting the commander. We are not heavily a creature-focused deck, but we do have enough creatures to put our combat-focused auras onto. And then we have 4 cards that can make creature tokens. These all have the potential to produce large numbers of tokens under the right conditions, and give us an alternative go-wide win condition option. We've got 9 pieces of card draw and 10 pieces of mana ramp in this deck. And finally, we've got 10 pieces of single target removal and 3 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $155.22 on tcgplayer.com. So that's our curse-themed deck with Tiana Ship's Caretaker. So this deck is using a combination of curses and prison auras like Temporal Isolation to control our opponents and their creatures. But, and again I think this is true of any curse deck, so I really want to reiterate, curses are generally not a win condition. Again, very few curses will actually kill an opponent. Some can, but most don't. So any curse deck needs some other way to actually finish games. And we've done that here with combat-focused auras, like All That Glitters and Mantle of the Ancients, along with creatures that like to be enchanted, like Wyleth and Heavenly Blade Master. As well as some token makers to let us go wide if we need to. So this is sort of a Boros control deck, which is fairly unusual, but it still has a focus on the combat step, as you'd expect from the color combination. And that is all I've got for today. Let me know in the comments what you think of this deck tech, or if you have any other commanders or strategies that you'd like to see a future deck tech built around, especially unconventional strategies. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.